She lied in one line: no dependence. That was what Nora Vale wrote beneath her name when she answered the ranch advertisement in the Montana Gazette. Widow, able to cook, able to keep books, no dependence. The first three things were true enough. The last one was not. She had two daughters tucked under her coat on the night the northbound stage froze half-buried beside Miller Pass. Hattie was 8, silent from too much fear. Pearl was 4, too cold to cry. And somewhere beyond the white wall of the blizzard, one lamp burned inside the house of the man Nora had already deceived. The coach did not crash. It simply gave up. For miles, the wheels had been cutting crooked trenches through the drifts, the driver cursing the horses in a voice that grew weaker every time he used it. Then the right side sank. The whole box leaned. The left wheel lifted into the air. Nora caught the window strap with one hand and Hattie with the other. Pearl did not wake. That was the part that made Nora afraid. Not the storm, not the lost road, not the fact that she had 37 cents in the bottom seam of her purse and nowhere in the world to spend it. It was Pearl's silence. The little girl lay under 2 shawls and the sleeve of Nora's spare dress, her mouth slack, her lashes crusted white at the edges. "Hattie," Nora said low, "keep your hands on your sister." "I am." Hattie's voice was not frightened. That was worse. 8-year-old girls were meant to sound frightened in storms. Hattie sounded as if she had already seen the ending and was only waiting for adults to admit it. Nora pushed the door open. The wind slammed into the coach like an animal trying to climb inside. "Mr. Dowry," she called. No answer. She crawled out into snow past her knees and used the side of the tilted coach to pull herself upward. The driver sat folded over the reins, his hat gone, his shoulders rounded beneath a hard shell of ice. The horses were gone too. The traces had snapped. Whether they had broken before Mr. Dowry died or after, Nora would never know. They had run toward whatever instinct promised them life, leaving a dead man, a stranded coach, and a mother with 2 children inside it. Nora looked into the white. She forced herself to remember the last thing the driver had said before the storm took his voice. Crooked Ridge. A cattle outfit 3 miles off the freight road, owned by a man named Elias Kincaid. There was a marker post where the private road turned, a blackened cedar stake with a strip of tin nailed to it so it would catch lantern light. They had passed it before sundown. The driver had pointed with his whip and said, "That's Kincaid's road. Hard man. Good stock." Nora had remembered the post because remembering small things had kept her alive longer than pride ever had. She climbed back into the coach. "Is he dead?" Hattie asked. "Yes." The answer came out plain, because there was no kindness in making the truth walk farther than it had to. Hattie looked at Pearl. "Are we going to stay here?" "No." "Then where?" Nora pulled the last dry thing from her carpet bag, a cotton underskirt mended so many times it had become more patch than cloth. She wrapped it around Pearl's feet. "There is a ranch." "In this?" Nora looked at her older daughter. Hattie had a bruise fading along her jaw, the last gift from a house in St. Joseph where a woman had charged them for a floor corner and then accused Hattie of stealing bread. The bruise had turned yellow now. That seemed like proof of something. Not healing exactly, but time continuing. "In this," Nora said. The road was not a road anymore. It was a suspicion under snow. Nora carried Pearl against her chest, inside the open front of her coat. Hattie held the back of Nora's skirt with one hand so the wind would not separate them. Twice Hattie fell. Twice she stood without crying. The first time Nora thought she saw a light. She said nothing. Hope could make a person waste strength chasing a thing that was only ice in the eye. The second time the light held, small, amber, low to the ground, a window. The ranch house appeared by pieces. First the roof line, then the black rectangle of a barn, then a porch half swallowed by snow. The buildings were built low and stern, as if the land had taught them humility. Nora climbed the porch steps with Pearl in her arms, and Hattie pressed against her side. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Boots crossed the floor inside. The door opened. The man holding the lantern was not what Nora had imagined from the advertisement. Elias Kincaid was not old, not soft, not the kind of man who had grown comfortable enough to become careless. He was perhaps 36, dark-haired, narrow through the face, with winter in the lines around his eyes and work in the set of his hands. He looked at Nora, then at Pearl, then at Hattie, whose braids were stiff with ice. He did not ask who they were first. He said, "Bring the child in." That was the first mercy. Not warmth, not food, not shelter. The first mercy was that he knew which question could wait. Inside, the house smelled of pine smoke, boiled coffee, and a loneliness so old it had become part of the timber. There was one chair at the table. Nora saw that before she saw anything else. One chair, one cup, one plate drying beside the stove, one wool coat hanging by the door. Elias swept a rifle cleaning rag, a ledger, and a coil of harness leather off the table in one motion. "Here." Nora laid Pearl down. The child's face had gone pale in a way that made every thought in Nora's mind become useless except the next one. "Blankets," Nora said. "Warm water, not hot." "I know." He was already moving. Hattie stayed by the door, dripping snow on the clean floor, her eyes fixed on Elias as if measuring how far his arm could reach. "Come to the fire," Nora said. "I'm fine." "You are not being asked to prove anything." Hattie came then, because she understood command better than comfort. Elias returned with blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Nora wrapped Pearl from the middle outward, hands shaking but efficient. The worst thing would be too much heat too quickly. She had seen a man lose 2 toes in Missouri because someone had tried to thaw him like meat. Pearl made a small sound. Nora bent over her. Again, a breath. Thin, but there. Only when Pearl's color began to return did Elias speak the part that had been waiting between them. "You are Mrs. Vale." Nora kept one hand on Pearl's chest. "Yes." "You wrote me from St. Joseph." "Yes." You wrote no dependence. The fire cracked once. Nora looked at the man whose roof was currently saving her child's life. She had rehearsed explanations across 3 territories, reasonable ones, defensive ones, some clever enough to be almost respectable. None of them survived the sight of Pearl on that table. "I lied," Nora said. "I knew you would not hire a widow with 2 children. I needed the position. I needed distance from a man who had begun using the law like a rope. I chose the lie because the truth would have left us nowhere." Elias watched her. Hattie watched him. The room held still. Then Elias picked up the basin and set it closer to Nora's hand. "Water's warm," he said, "not hot." Nora had prepared herself for anger, for the door opening behind her, for the sentence men used when they wanted cruelty to sound practical. Instead, he went to the stove and cut salt pork into a pan. "Have either of you eaten today?" Nora almost lied again out of habit. "No." "Then we'll fix that next." He said it as if hunger were a broken hinge or a fence rail split in the weather. A problem, not a judgment. Pearl opened her eyes an hour later. She looked at the ceiling, then the fire, then Elias Kincaid standing near the stove. "You have a tall house," she whispered. Elias looked up. "It is only 1 story." "It feels tall." Something crossed his face so quickly Nora could not name it. "Maybe it was waiting for someone short," he said. Pearl considered this, then fell asleep with cornbread crumbs on her lips. The storm lasted 3 days. On the first day, Nora moved carefully. She mended what had to be mended, washed what had to be washed, and never stepped into a closed room. On the second day, she learned the kitchen by touch. The flour was poorly stored. The beans were damp at the back of the shelf. The stove drew unevenly. There was a draft in the east bedroom, low near the floor, exactly where a child sleeping in the smaller bed would feel it. On the third day, she made biscuits without asking permission. Elias came in from the barn with snow frozen along his sleeves, stopped at the stove, and looked at the pan. He took one. He did not compliment it. He ate 2 more. Nora took that as a signed contract. The real conversation happened on the 4th day, when the road was passable enough to mean she could be sent away. Elias came in at noon and found soup on the stove, Hattie reading an old cattle almanac, and Pearl arranging buttons in a line on the hearth. He stood in the doorway long enough that Nora noticed. Then he removed his gloves. "You came for work." "Yes." "You lied to get it." "Yes." He sat at the table. He had added a second chair that morning. Nora had not asked where it came from. "The work is still here," he said. "Room, board, $5 a month until spring. 6 if you can keep the accounts straighter than I have." "I can." "I believe that." She looked up then, because belief was not a word she had heard often from men with power over her. Elias went on. "The girls stay in the back room. They help where it is sensible and stay away from what is dangerous. I do not run a nursery. I do not know how." "I'm not asking you to." "No." He looked toward the hearth, where Pearl had made a private kingdom out of 12 mismatched buttons. "But the house may ask me anyway." That was the first time Nora almost smiled. At the door, before he went back to the barn, Elias turned. Mrs. Vale? Yes. Do not lie to me again. Need is not the same thing as permission. The words were hard enough to land, but not cruel. So Nora answered him in the same manner. Fair. From then on, the house began to change in small ways nobody announced. The draught in the east bedroom disappeared after Elias spent one evening with oakum and a knife, packing the gap under the sill. He did not mention it. Nora did not thank him in front of the children. Hattie repaired a loose pantry brace with scrap wood from behind the stove, then pretended she had not. The next morning, a square of maple sugar sat on the shelf nearest her school slate. Pearl took to following Elias as far as the barn door and asking questions. Why did horses sleep standing? Why did one cow have a star on her head? Why was his left hand stiff in the cold? Rope burn, he said once, flexing the scarred fingers. Did it hurt? Yes. Did you yell? No. Why? Nobody nearby who would have improved the situation by hearing it. Pearl nodded as if this was sound frontier logic. Hattie watched from a distance. She was too old to trust quickly, and too young to hide that she wanted to. By January, Crooked Ridge had a rhythm. Elias rose before first light. Nora had coffee ready before the kettle finished muttering. Hattie read at the south window, where the thin winter sun was best. Pearl kept her buttons in an empty tobacco tin and counted them each night before bed. That counting became one of the house's quiet sounds. Then the first letter came, not for Nora, for Elias. It arrived with the supply wagon, folded inside a county notice and sealed with blue wax. Elias read it on the porch. Nora saw his face close before she saw the paper. "What is it?" she asked. "Water." That was all he said at first. Later, at the table, he spread out a survey map. The map had been opened and folded so many times the creases had become pale lines across the valley. A land buyer named Victor Brand had filed a challenge on the spring branch that fed Elias's lower pasture. Not the land itself, the water. Brand claimed the spring had been part of an abandoned freight easement before Elias purchased Crooked Ridge. If the claim held, he could sell access to a rail contractor and cut Elias's grazing season in half. "Can he do that?" Nora asked. "Anyone can file a claim," Elias said. "Truth only matters after you have paid to defend it." He said it without bitterness, which made it sound worse. Nora leaned over the map. The spring branch curved along the lower meadow past 3 old witness stones and the collapsed freight culvert. "These marks," she said, "are they original?" Elias looked at her. "The stones?" "Yes." "Older than my deed." "Then they matter." He waited. Nora touched the map near the creek. "My father lost 40 acres in Ohio because no one recorded the condition of boundary stones before a hearing. The other side did not have to prove he lied. They only had to make the judge wonder." Elias looked at the map again. "You know survey evidence. I know what losing it sounds like. That night they worked until the lamp burned low. Nora wrote descriptions of each stone, the moss line, the buried edge, the angle of leaning, the depth of frost around the base. Elias added 7 years of ranch knowledge she could not invent: where cattle crossed, when the spring ran dry, where the old freight track had truly gone. By midnight they had 6 pages of notes and a plan to bring in Mr. Ansel, the county attorney in Black Pine. Nora looked at the table. 2 chairs now, 2 cups, a map between them. The house was still lonely, but the loneliness no longer had the room entirely to itself. The hearing on the water claim was set for March. All through February, Elias and Nora prepared. They photographed the stones with Ansel's box camera when the weather allowed. Hattie copied dates into a clean ledger because her penmanship was steadier than either adult expected. Pearl carried kindling, miscounted eggs, and told the barn cat secrets. The water hearing lasted less than an hour. Brand's lawyer called the spring a technical question. Ansel called it the thing that kept cattle alive. Nora testified only to what she had seen: stone placement, weathering, frost disturbance, and the old culvert's true position. When the lawyer tried to make her sound like a meddling housekeeper, she did not argue. She simply answered. I wrote down what was there before anyone had reason to move it. That line stayed in the room. The judge dismissed Brand's claim pending appeal. Outside, under a March sky bruised with rain, Elias stood beside Nora on the courthouse steps. You saved the water, he said. No, Nora said. The water was already yours. He looked across Main Street at the muddy hitch rail. Yes, but you helped prove it before a man could make doubt expensive. That was as close as Elias came to celebration. It was enough. Spring entered Montana in pieces. First, the snow sagged along the fence posts. Then the yard turned to mud. Then the lower meadow showed a strip of green so bright it looked almost reckless against the brown earth. Nora began to believe in days that came after other days. That was a dangerous form of peace, because peace made the next letter feel like a hand closing around the back of her neck. It arrived in April, Missouri postmark. The handwriting was careful, heavy, and familiar. Abram Vale, her husband's older brother, the man she had run from. Nora took the envelope to the back room before she opened it. That alone told her body what her mind was trying to deny. The letter was polite. Abram was concerned for the welfare of his late brother's daughters. Abram had received information that Nora was living in a remote territory under uncertain employment conditions. Abram intended to travel west and assert his rightful interest as nearest male kin. He did not threaten. He did not have to. Elias found her at the kitchen table after dark, the letter folded once beside her hand. He read it. Then he read it again. How soon? I don't know. What does he want? The girls. Elias set the letter down. Does he care for them? No. Then why? Nora looked toward the back room, where Pearl was asleep, and Hattie was pretending not to listen. Because taking them would prove he could. Abram believes the world has an order. Men first, paper second, women somewhere below weather. Elias's jaw moved once. We talk to Ansel tomorrow. Yes. but they both knew the shape of the problem before the attorney confirmed it. A widow employed in another man's house was vulnerable. A woman with no property was vulnerable. A mother who had fled one jurisdiction to avoid a guardianship petition could be made to look unstable by a patient lawyer with clean cuffs. Ansel said it plainly 2 days later. Your strongest protection is a stable household with legal standing. Nora looked at the wall behind his desk. Elias looked at the floor. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Elias said, "Marriage." Ansel took off his spectacles. It would not solve everything, but it would change what Abram Vale is walking into. They rode home in near silence. The proposal came that night by the stove, while Rain tapped the window and Pearl counted buttons in the next room. Elias stood with both hands on the back of the second chair. "I will marry you if you want the protection of it." Nora looked at him. He continued before she could answer. "I am not dressing this up as something it is not. The law would see the girls in a property household. It would give me standing to stand with you. Abram would have to fight a family, not corner a widow." He stopped, then quieter. "But I will not say it is only law." Nora's hands tightened around her cup. Elias looked uncomfortable, which on him meant deeply honest. "I do not know the proper words for the rest. I know I notice when Pearl's buttons are not in their tin. I know Hattie reads the room before she enters it, and I have started trying to make the room easier to read. I know there are 4 places at supper now, unless someone forgets, and I do not like the table with fewer." Nora looked at the man who had opened his door while she was still a lie on his threshold. Then she looked toward the bedroom where her daughters slept. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "Yes, I will marry you." Elias nodded once, not because it meant little, because it meant enough that neither of them knew what to do with it if they handled it too quickly.
They were married 5 days later in Ansel's office, before a territorial judge who smelled faintly of tobacco and wet wool. It took 9 minutes. Nora wore her gray dress. Elias wore a clean shirt and combed his hair badly enough that Hattie stared at it all through supper later and said nothing, which was an act of mercy. Pearl asked whether being married meant she could call the barn cat her cousin. "No," Hattie said. "Maybe," Elias said. Hattie looked at him as if reconsidering his intelligence. For 2 weeks after, nothing happened. That was how fear worked. It made absence feel like a trap being built out of quiet. Then Abram came.
He arrived in the late afternoon with a hired driver and a black coat too fine for the road. Nora saw him from the pantry window and felt every season between Missouri and Montana collapse into one breath. Elias was already outside. He did not wait on the porch. He walked to the gate. That mattered. Abram had expected to approach the house. Elias made him stop at the line. From inside, Nora watched Abram speak with the calm patience she remembered. His hands moved only once. Elias did not move at all. After several minutes, they came toward the house. Nora sent the girls to the back room. Hattie understood immediately. Pearl did not, but Hattie held her hand and made her quiet. Abram entered Crooked Ridge and looked around as if inventorying a place he planned to challenge. Clean stove, filled wood box, school slate, 4 coats by the door. His eyes found Nora. Nora, Abram, then Elias. So this is the husband. This is Elias Kincaid, Nora said. This is his house. Our house, Elias said. Abram smiled slightly. 4 weeks of marriage does not make a father. No, Elias said, but it does make you early. Abram's smile faded. He produced papers from inside his coat. Petition for guardianship. Notice of intent. Statements from 2 men in Missouri prepared to speak to Abram's character. Paper. Always paper. Elias took the documents, glanced through them, and set them on the table as if they were not allowed to decide the weight of the room. Our attorney will answer, he said. I would like to see my nieces. No, Nora said. Abram turned to her. The old look appeared, the one that asked whether she had forgotten how small he could make a person feel. Nora had not forgotten. She had simply become tired of helping him. You came unannounced, she said. You brought a hired man. You brought papers, not concern. You will see our attorney before you see my children. Abram's eyes sharpened at our. You have changed, he said. No, Nora said. I have witnesses now. For the first time since she had known him, Abram had no ready answer. He left with the slow dignity of a man who wanted departure to look like choice. When the wagon disappeared down the road, Nora opened the bedroom door. Hattie stood with Pearl tucked behind her. Is he taking us? Hattie asked. No. Is he trying? Yes. Hattie looked past her mother to Elias standing in the main room. What will you do? Elias answered before Nora could soften it. Stand in his way by law first, by every other decent means after. Hattie stared at him. She did not thank him. She said, okay. From Hattie, okay was not a small word. The custody hearing was set for May 14th. Black Pine County Courthouse. Ansel prepared the case the way a careful man lays stones in a wall. Marriage certificate, property records, household accounts. Testimony from the Calloway family down the creek who had watched the girls grow healthier through winter. Schoolwork. Church attendance. The judge's record from the water claim proving Nora's credibility under oath. Then Ansel asked for one more thing. A statement from Hattie. Nora said no before he finished. Hattie, from the doorway, said, I'll write it. Everyone turned. She stood with her arms crossed and her chin lifted. If the judge is deciding where we live, he can hear from someone who has to live there. Nora closed her eyes for one breath. Then she opened them. All right. Hattie wrote for 2 nights. She would not let Nora see the pages until they were finished. When she finally placed them on the table, she stood at the window with her back turned while Nora read. The letter was plain. That made it harder. Hattie wrote about Missouri, about Abram standing in their kitchen after the funeral with his hat in his hand and ownership in his voice, about her mother packing at night, about Pearl coughing in a rented room, about the stage freezing in the mountains. Then she wrote about Crooked Ridge. She wrote that Mr. Kincaid had let them in before he asked about the lie. She wrote that he fixed the draft under Pearl's bed and did not make anyone thank him. She wrote that when a pantry shelf broke, he left maple sugar where the person who fixed it would find it. Then she wrote one sentence that made Nora sit down. A man who wants power makes children feel watched. A man who wants to keep children safe learns what they are watching for. Elias read it once. He folded it carefully. Then he went outside and stayed by the woodpile for a long time, with no axe in his hand. The courthouse was full on May 14th. Custody cases drew people who pretended to be there for business. Nora saw ranch wives, merchants, 2 freight men, Mrs. Calloway, and half the town pretending not to look. Abram sat with his attorney, Mr. Belden, a clean-shaven man who looked expensive in a county where expensive looked almost indecent. The judge was named Ora Finch. She was smaller than Nora expected and sharper than anyone in the room seemed prepared for. Belden presented Abram first. Nearest male kin. Long family connection. Respectable home in Missouri. Concern for the daughter's welfare. A hasty marriage in Montana made under obvious legal pressure. He made Nora sound like a woman running from order. He made Elias sound like a convenient roof. Then Ansel stood. He did not raise his voice. He brought paper after paper to the bench. The court had seen Nora under oath and found her credible. The girls had schooling. The ranch was solvent. The household was stable. The mother had not abandoned her children. She had preserved them. Mrs. Calloway testified that Pearl had gained weight since winter, and Hattie no longer flinched when men entered rooms too quickly. Abram's attorney objected. Judge Finch said, "Overruled. That observation is precisely the sort of fact this court finds useful." Hattie's letter was admitted over objection. The judge read it in silence. The whole room waited while a dead quiet settled over the benches. When she finished, Judge Finch placed the pages flat on the desk and did not look at Abram first. She looked at Nora. Then she looked at Elias. Ansel called him next. Elias walked to the front and sat in the witness chair as if it were a fence rail that needed mending. Uncomfortable, but not beyond use. Ansel asked the formal questions: name, residence, property, marriage date. Then he asked, "Mr. Kincaid, what are Hattie and Pearl Vale to you?" Elias was silent long enough that Belden shifted in his seat. "I did not ask for them," Elias said. No one moved. "I placed an advertisement for a housekeeper. Their mother answered it without telling me the whole truth. I had reason to be angry about that. I was angry about it." He glanced once at Nora, not apologizing, simply telling it clean. But the night they arrived, anger was not the work in front of me. A child was freezing on my table, so we warmed her. Then the storm kept them. Then winter kept them. Then, somewhere in all that, I began keeping track. Judge Finch leaned back slightly. Elias went on. "Pearl counts buttons before bed. If the tin is under the bench in the morning, she slept well. If it is beside the hearth, she woke before dawn and tried not to wake anyone else." Pearl was not in the room to hear this. Nora wished she were. Hattie notices exits, drafts, broken boards, loose hinges, and the mood of every adult before that adult speaks. That is not misbehavior. That is training no child should have needed. So I have tried to make a house where she can stop needing it. His voice remained level, not polished, not sentimental. That made the words impossible to dismiss. I married Nora because the law gives weight to things men sign and too little weight to things women survive. That is the legal truth. But it is not the whole truth. He looked directly at the judge. The whole truth is that my table has 4 places now. I notice when one is empty. I would defend that whether the law had a word for it or not. Belden cross-examined for 13 minutes. He tried to make Elias sound lonely. Elias agreed he had been. He tried to make the marriage sound strategic. Elias agreed it was. He tried to make 4 months sound too short for a family. Elias looked at him and said, "A blizzard can change a life in one night. 4 months is long enough to decide what you will not let be taken." Belden sat down. Judge Finch took 28 minutes. Nora counted none of them, and every one. When the judge returned, she read from her notes. Abram Vale's petition was denied. No guardianship rights. No removal. No unsupervised contact. The existing household of Nora Kincaid, Elias Kincaid, Hattie Vale, and Pearl Vale was recognized as stable, protective, and in the best interests of the children. Nora heard the words, but she did not feel them at first. Fear had lived in her body too long to leave just because a judge told it to. Then Elias put his hand over hers on the table. Briefly, plainly. A fact, not a performance. And something inside Nora, something that had been clenched since Missouri, finally understood it could unclench. She folded the order and placed it inside her coat. Not because paper had saved her. Paper had not opened the door in the blizzard. Paper had not warmed Pearl. Paper had not left maple sugar for a child too cautious to ask for kindness. But this paper would stop Abram Vale from walking into her life with a clean collar and calling his hunger duty. That mattered. On the wagon ride home, Elias kept the horses slow through the mud. After a long while, Nora said, "The buttons." He looked at the road. "What about them?" "You check them." "Yes." "Every morning?" "Most." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because if they are in order, I know she ended the night believing tomorrow was worth arranging." Nora looked away before he could see what that did to her face. When they reached Crooked Ridge, Pearl ran from the porch before the wagon stopped. Hattie came slower, as always, because caution had not left her just because danger had. Nora climbed down. "It is over," she said. "The judge said no. Abram cannot take you." Pearl threw both arms around Nora's waist. Hattie looked at Elias. The letter worked? It helped, Nora said. Hattie's eyes stayed on Elias. "What did you say?" Elias removed his hat. "That there are 4 places at the table." Hattie looked toward the house. Then, without asking permission from herself for too long, she crossed the yard and put her arms around him. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was the first time Hattie had hugged a man without bracing her feet. Elias stood very still until she let go. Then Pearl announced that the barn cat had kittens in the grain bin, and one had a black ear, and she had already named it Judge. Hattie said, "You cannot name a cat Judge." Pearl said, "The judge helped us." Hattie said, "That is not how names work." Elias said, "I have known worse reasons." And because the day had been too large for everyone, they followed Pearl to the barn to inspect the legal kitten. Nora stayed in the yard a moment longer. Crooked Ridge lay around her in May light. The barn, the water branch below the meadow, the porch steps where she had arrived with a frozen child and a lie in her pocket. The window of the room where her daughters now slept without their coats on. She had once believed home was the place you had before disaster found you. Then she believed it was any roof you could reach before dark. Now she understood something harder and better. Home was not the place that never asked questions. Home was the place where the right questions could wait until the living were safe. It was the window sealed before a child complained, the sugar left without applause, the map spread between two cups at midnight, the chair added before anyone asked where to sit, the table set for four, often enough that four became the truth. That evening, Nora put one log on the fire, just one, enough to hold the room warm without wasting what the night did not need. Then she set the table. 4 plates, 4 cups, 4 places. Outside, the Montana sky deepened from gold to blue, and the first stars came over the ridge. Inside, Pearl argued that Judge the cat had a legal right to milk. Hattie objected on grounds no one had explained. Elias washed his hands at the basin and listened as if the argument mattered. Nora stood by the stove and watched them come into the room one by one. The lie had brought her to the door. The truth was what made it home.